If you've explored the Marvel Universe, then you've probably come across Howard the Duck. He's a cigar-smoking, beer-drinking duck alien who is zapped from his home of Duck World to, where else? Cleveland, Ohio. Hi, you're listening to Cleveland Magazine's Cleveland Connections podcast, where we take a closer look at the stories and surprising connections to Northeast Ohio in pop culture. My name is Annie Nikoloff, and when I first started thinking about topics for this podcast, I immediately thought about Howard the Duck. Howard first appeared in the 1970s as a minor character in Marvel's Adventure into Fear comic series. His earliest appearances are full of duck puns and funny fights, and he later became so popular that he got his own comic book series. He was even the star of the 1986 movie Howard the Duck, which was produced by George Lucas and which has gone down in history as one of the worst movies ever made. You can even see Howard the Duck pop up in more recent Marvel movies like Guardians of the Galaxy. While Howard is based in Cleveland, there's actually one more Cleveland connection to his story. Val Mayerik, a Youngstown native, was the first to draw Howard, a character created by comic book writer Steve Gerber. Val has lived in Cleveland Heights, Lakewood, New York City, and Portland, Oregon, and these days he lives in Austin, Texas, where he's busy with a couple of comic book and graphic novel projects. I caught up with Val to hear more about his comic book writing career and his involvement with the infamous Howard the Duck.
Well, there was that. I think Howard first appeared in comics back in, I think, 74, 75, maybe even earlier. The writer, Steve Gerber, who I have to really give most of the credit goes to Steve. I mean, that character was Steve's alter ego. And Steve passed away about 5, maybe 7 years, well, quite a while ago. But anyway, I was the first one to draw Howard. So that's my pedigree there. Since then, a lot of people have drawn him. The look of the duck has changed a lot. But whenever people request sketches of Howard at conventions or they want a private commission, I draw Howard in the original way that I had drawn him back in the 70s. So Steve and I were working on a comic book called The Man Thing. The Man Thing was this swamp monster who hung out in the Everglades, and I don't recall all the history of the Man Thing, but one thing about the Man Thing is that it even though it was a very primitive beast, it had this psychic ability to open up portals into other dimensions and other parts of the universe. And in one issue, it did that, and this portal stayed open, and a bunch of people came through from all over the universe. And there was like a magician type hero, or not a hero, just a magician type guy, and there was a barbarian warrior type guy, and then Howard came through. And that's where and then I think he went back, I'm not sure, but then when it came to Howard having his own comic book, Howard manifested himself and emerged in Cleveland when he came to Earth for the first time from Duck World. How and why that happened and what Steve was actually going for at that point, I don't remember. But that's how Howard got associated with Cleveland.
Well, that must have been pretty interesting for you, being from Northeast Ohio, having spent a lot of time in Cleveland, to now be illustrating a duck superhero who is in Cleveland, whose story eventually lands him in Cleveland.
Well, first of all, Howard has no superpowers. He's not really a superhero. Howard is kind of like the Greek chorus for humanity. He's the one who's making the commentary. And he feels he has the right to make the commentary because he's not a human being. So he has a distance which we don't have. So it was fun. It was, at the time when the character first appeared, it wasn't really clear that it was going to be that popular and that it was going to catch on the way it did. Actually, I only drew a few early issues of Howard. When Marvel decided to give Howard his own title, I was working on other projects that I was really having fun with. And so they gave it to another artist who was a very good artist. And I don't think I was back on the book for quite a few years. Oh, I did when I moved to New York City, I was working on there was Howard the Duck. There was also a daily newspaper strip. And I was working on that for quite a while. That was killed because for a lot of reasons, things associated with Steve died because Steve, and I'm not trying to tell tales out of school or and Steve's not around to defend himself, but he would be the first to admit that he was terrible with deadlines, just terrible with deadlines. I was constantly drawing really, really fast, trying to catch up with Steve's tardiness, and so eventually the comic strip syndrome called Marvel and said we can't deal with these late with this kind of tardiness, so it's over, so they pulled the strip. That was that. So I did have a run on that as well, and then from there on I did a lot of fill-in issues for because an artist would quit again because they were tired of Steve, and until Marvel found somebody else, they would have me do it. So I have not worked on the Duck, on the new version of the Duck that came out about 6-8 years ago. I've not done any work on that.
I'd love to hear more about Steve too, who really developed this character. What can you tell me about him as a comic book creator?
Well, Steve was definitely his own man. He was kind of ornery. If he was alive today, I don't think he would be a Democrat or a Republican. I think he was more of just an outlier. His social outlook was probably a little more liberal, but I don't think he would have been a radical, for instance. I think he just was kind of an ornery guy that found upon his observation of the world, he found a lot of things that were wrong, and he wanted to comment on, and he did that through the Duck.
I was reading online that early depictions of Howard the Duck, so maybe when you were involved, were maybe a little bit reminiscent of Donald Duck, and that maybe you guys got in trouble with Disney. I didn't know. I kind of wanted to ask about that, if there was any truth to that.
Well, yeah, there was some feedback from Disney, I think back in the 80s, about the Duck looking too much like Donald Duck, and they did make some changes. But the way the Duck looks now is entirely, I mean, it doesn't even look like a duck. It looks like a pigeon, so I can't. And then Disney bought Marvel. And so once that happened, I don't know really what the conflict would have been, because they just don't want the two characters to be confused or what. I really couldn't tell. I know that whenever I do my version of the Duck, Marvel has no complaint with that.
I feel like one way a lot of people know about Howard the Duck is through the movie, which I watched last night for the first time. And it is probably one of the stranger movies I've ever seen. I was wondering if you saw that when it came out, if you thought that was a good depiction of the comic book that you helped sort of spawn, if you could speak to that at all.
Well, I never saw the movie when it first came out because I was invited to a premiere in Los Angeles by Marvel. I didn't. Steve said it was terrible. He said, "Don't go, don't see it." So well, again, Steve was pretty ornery, and he wasn't going to please Steve. So I never did watch it for the longest time. Then when I moved to Texas in 2013, I made friends with a guy who was kind of connected to the comic book convention circuit, and he had a lot of connections around Austin, and he was able to commandeer a theater and an old 35 millimeter print of the film. And so we had a screening of the film and then a Q&A afterwards, in which I would talk to the audience about. And enough time had gone by where I just looked at it, watched it, and just saw it for what it was. I wasn't thinking about where Marvel was at the time, what their policies were, or what Steve's attitude about the Duck was. I just watched it, and I kind of got a kick out of it. It was kind of fun. I thought the voice of the Duck was kind of corny. That didn't really work for me. And one thing I couldn't figure, it was, they were true to the original story about how Howard showing up in Cleveland, and then Leah Thompson is supposed to be singing. I don't know where she's in the flats or where, somewhere in Cleveland. And, it would have been so easy for them to send a second unit to Cleveland and actually get some actual Cleveland landscape and real lakefront footage, but they didn't. And you can see the San Bernardino Mountains in the background half the time. So it sure doesn't ring as Cleveland. But for the little jaunt of a film that it was, I enjoyed it.
I did too. It was bizarre, and I've started reading the comic book too. I could see some differences maybe in the material, but also some similarities, right? He's smoking cigars, he's drinking beer, he's got some of that character that
Yeah.
you guys put into him. So that was pretty fun. And I know too, in more recent years, he's had sort of this revival in the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, these little,
Yes.
sightings of him. What's it been like to see him kind of come back in these modern depictions?
Well, that's been really interesting. And that's again, like I said, I kind of took a hiatus from comics and didn't really get back into it full-fledged. I did a couple of graphic novels and that was about it. And so thus far, but that's really raised my profile in the comic book world. And so I get to go to conventions and talk to fans. And I get a lot of requests via email for people that people sent. They send me all their old Howard the Duck stuff, and I sign it and do some sketches for them and send it back. So that's been fun. That's been interesting.
Why do you think he's sort of captured attention the way he has? Like, why do you think he's resurged in interest in recent years?
Well, I think for the same reason he did initially, he's different. He's able to fit into this fantastic world. He's not a realistic character, obviously, but yet he's not vying his superpowers against somebody else's superpowers. And he's just a character. He's just an interesting, character with some interesting, some interesting things to say.
And I know you mentioned this earlier, which is a really good point. He's not a superhero. He's not a conventional, Marvel character that we all rally around, the really big ones today. But what would you say in response to people who call him like the worst hero in the Marvel universe? I've seen rankings. I've seen Howard the Duck at, the bottom of the rankings. Like, how would you sort of respond to that thought?
Well, I don't know. That's pretty strange. I've never seen those rankings or heard about them, but I would assume people that don't like him are people that want action heroes, and Howard will not provide that. And I don't think that even though Steve's gone, I think just Marvel would always try to remain in the spirit of the original character and not give him any kind of. Actually, I think I wasn't drawing the book at the time, but I think Steve did do a series of stories back in the 70s or 80s where Howard did manage to attain some sort of a superpower, but it didn't work out for him. He didn't keep it, and I could be wrong about that. But whenever there's been an attempt to have Howard confront or another supervillain, he usually uses his wits to outwit to triumph over them. So.
Yeah, I'd love to go back even further. I know you talked about growing up in Youngstown. I'd love to hear how you like first got drawn into the comic book world and just into making art in the first place.
Well, I was drawing all the time as a little kid. I began drawing when I was like 2 or 3. My mother put some crayons in my hand, and that's what I started doing. I always had a knack for drawing things naturalistically, realistically. I used to love and just pore over these Norman Rockwell covers of the Saturday Evening Post magazines, and that's what I wanted to do. Is I wanted to draw very realistically and depict scenes. To do storytelling with the art. I went to Youngstown State University and went to their art department, which was wretchedly bad, and there was just a lot of frustrated old beatniks that were had not probably couldn't make it in New York City, and so they were encouraging the students to throw paint at the wall, and that's supposed to be some sort of profound expression. And I expressed the desire to want to learn to have figure drawing classes and learn to draw academically, and I was scorned for that. I mean, just absolutely, they didn't want to hear it, and so I just kind of stuck around with that in the art department because I really had no place else to go. I wasn't about to become an engineering student or so. And I did do some acting in the drama. I spent more time in the drama department, theater department than the art department. And I really didn't know what I was going to do. It was in my 4th year of school. I was still a junior, and I just did not know what would become of me. And I did like comics at the time. And actually, I didn't read comics much as a kid. I read I read all the little Uncle Scrooge comics when I was really a little kid. But then all through junior high school, I did not read comics. In college, I discovered some of the more offbeat, the black and white magazine format comics the horror comics that were being printed. And I liked those. I liked the artwork in them. And I was in a painting class with this other guy who now does some work, and he's from Cleveland. He does some work from comics. Joe Zabel, who did some work for Harvey Pekar. He and I were talking about comics, and we were a woman who at the time seemed like a much older woman. She was in her like early 30s. We were in our early 20s, and she was finishing her degree so she could teach or something like that. And she said, well, I know this guy in my neighborhood who inks comics. His name is Dan Atkins. Did you ever hear of him? I said, oh my God, yes, of course I've heard of him. She said, well, he lives, 3 or 4 houses down from me. So I just went home and just got all my sketches and drawings and scraps of stuff. And I just took them down to Dan. And I said, Dan, I don't know what, can you help me get into comics? I had no idea if there was even a procedure here. I just figured if he's the only person I know that's working in the business, so I got to talk to him. He liked my work. He said maybe I could come down and be his assistant, but he wasn't sure because he had another guy working with him at the time, a guy named Craig Russell, who went on to become a very well-known comic book illustrator. So eventually Dan said it was okay for me to move. And so I moved down to East Liverpool. That was in East Liverpool. I forgot to mention that's where that lady was living. And I went down to East Liverpool, got an apartment there and started working with Dan. Craig and I worked with Dan as assistants for just a couple of months. And then Dan told us to do some sample pages and he submitted them to Marvel. And we took a Greyhound bus to New York City and met Roy Thomas and Stan Lee, and we were in the business. It was just really a stroke of luck, because had I not met Dan, I don't think I was the kind of guy that had the temperament to go like move to New York City and work, as an office boy at Marvel until I could get, a break here or a break there and tolerate, life in the city. At that time, being poor, I couldn't have actually, endured that for any length of time. And I was too restless. The fact that I got to meet somebody in Ohio who could, take me step by step into the business was just an absolute stroke of incredible luck.
That's amazing. And just to hear how you landed there and you met Stan Lee, which is like incredible. Do you remember walking into the office for the first time?
Oh yeah, I've not been in the Marvel offices for a long time, but back then, of course, there were no computers on desks and so forth, and it wasn't that large of an office space, but it was a busy space. I would imagine today, if you want to go up and visit the Marvel offices, you couldn't get in unless you had some sort of a security pass or you were given a specific invitation. But you could just go right. It was right on Fifth Avenue. You could just take the elevator up and just get out of the elevator, and there you were. There were just a lot of people there doing comic book stuff, doing the lettering, situating the pages, getting everything ready for publication. And there was original art there. I mean, people were not creating art on the computer yet. So, I mean, that nobody would even have conceived of something like that. So there was all this original pencil pages of all our, the guys we admire so much, like Jack Kirby and Gil Kane and Neil Adams, all that gorgeous art just lying there. And we just would look at it and it was just astonishing. And Stan's office was, you could just, I remember a couple of times I knocked on Stan's door, and just said, Stan, can I ask you this or that? And he was a very affable guy. And he didn't put up with any nonsense, but he made himself available to people. That was quite extraordinary. At the time, of course, you don't realize how special these things are. But then 40 years later, it's like, wow, I had no idea how lucky I was,
Yeah, when they turn into what they eventually turn into, which is,
Yeah.
Marvel kind of dominating so much of our entertainment world. Thank you for sharing that and sharing those memories. I know you talked about a more recent return to the craft, to graphic novels and comics. Could you talk a little bit about your projects that are ongoing right now?
I've always wanted to do Western art, cowboy and Indian art. And I said, well, I'm in Texas and there's galleries here that exhibit that sort of stuff. And I want to see if I can break it. So I did a series of paintings and I took them up to Fort Worth, Dallas area, which is where most of the cowboy art galleries are. Most of the people were rejecting my work, and they wouldn't even tell me why. And it was good work, and I couldn't figure it out. I thought they must have some little niche for me, but I met a gallery owner or actually he was the gallery manager, who explained to me, he says, your art is really good. He says, but I've got the same stuff. I've got 5 paintings of the cowboy looking at the sunset. They're all good. He says, but because there's so many of them, I can't sell them. And he was a science fiction fan, and he knew a little bit about comics. He said, well, you have done all sorts of crazy stuff. Try to integrate that into your painting somehow. I said, well, how? What, UFOs and cowboys? That's just cornball. And I said, well, I was thinking about cowboys trying to rope a dinosaur. He said, paint it, do it, do it. So I did. I took it up to the gallery, and it just went gangbusters. They were selling prints of it. They sold the original. So started doing this whole series of cowboys and dinosaurs and Native Americans and dinosaurs without even having a scenario to back it up. Like, why are there dinosaurs in the Old West? And pretty soon I had a whole series of these paintings, which are now in a gallery here in Austin. It struck me that this is really good material for a graphic novel, for a graphic novel. And rather than, try to shop it around to the publishers, DC, Marvel, whatever, people are now doing crowdfunding like crazy. So this writer friend of mine up in Oregon, he and I had success with a graphic novel prior to that. So we're going to get together a crowdfunder for cowboys and dinosaurs. And there's a whole story behind, it'll be revealed, like, why are the dinosaurs there, and what happens, and what's the conflict, and so on and so forth. So that's the one thing I'm working on. And then I'm still working on the paintings, sending those to the gallery. They're being exhibited there. So that's one area I've been working in. And I am working on I don't know where to begin with this one. There's a guy in England. I forget his name now. It escapes me. I should have written it down, but he was the writer for a very successful graphic novel that was made into a movie, a couple of movies. And so he's done really well with that. He firmly believes in digital comics. He thinks comics on the internet are going to eventually happen. They haven't really caught on yet, but he has a digital comic series that he puts on, that he's got on the internet. It's called Aces Weekly. His name's David Lloyd. A couple of years ago, some guy from Paris, France, believe it or not, called me and wanted me to do a comic with him. And at the time, he teaches. He was a lifelong comic book fan. He teaches English in France. He speaks English very well. He knows all the vernacular. So speaking to him is no problem. There's no problem in translation. And I don't know why he chose me out of the hundreds of comic book artists that, he knows about. He chose me, and it's a really weird story. It's kind of a takeoff on science fiction stories, along with an adventure story, along with gang wars and stuff. It's crazy. It's called The Convoy, and it's about a truck convoy that goes through this apocalyptic world, and it's really crazy. And so that is now on that's now posted on Aces Weekly, which is the digital comic. I took this reluctantly because I know the digital comic thing isn't really going that well, but I was kind of flattered this guy asked me, this guy from France would pick me. And secondly, it's been great working with him. And he's also got another writer, a Canadian writer, working with him, who now lives in Australia. So when we do a Zoom call, it's kind of interesting to making sure that everybody's awake at that moment, at that hour. But I decided to stick with it because the deadline situation is very, very lax. I only have to provide 3 to 6 pages a month to do this, and it's fun to do. It's different, and it keeps me in that genre of pictorial storytelling. So I like that. So I'm working on that right now as well. I don't know where that's going to go, but we're having fun with it. Hopefully we will get the crowdfunder up for Cowboys and Dinosaurs. That's really what I'm looking forward to.
Thank you so much for sharing so much about your work.
I was anticipating you might ask me about Harvey Pekar.
Oh, please share. Did you work? I think you mentioned that you worked with Harvey.
Yeah, you mentioned, who Harvey was, of course.
Yes, yeah.
And his connection to Cleveland. And I had been living in Cleveland. I was back from New York for about 3 years, and I somehow, through somebody that knew somebody, I met Harvey. I said, I really like your work. I'd like to do some work for you. And he said, well, I can't pay much, and all that sort. But I said, oh, that's okay. I think your work is important, and I want to contribute. And he was very hesitant at first because he thought I was just going to do some superhero crazy type illustration. And I showed him a lot of my other work that was not comics related to assure him that I would not be making him, look like a superhero. And I worked for him on and off for a couple of years. It was a great experience. Harvey changed the look of independent publication and comics, and I really admired the guy for his stick-to-itiveness. And the movie that they made out of that, I thought, was a very, very accurate representation, very, very nice representation of Harvey and his life and his work. I really treasure those moments of having worked with Harvey. I mean, it didn't really elevate my career terribly much. I didn't make much money out of it, but it was just a great experience. I've been lucky, and I guess and the word to any other prospective comic book illustrator out there is, get out and see people. Even if your work even if you're a genius, if nobody knows you're out there, it's not going to matter. And with social media especially, it helps to post things and to get stuff out on Instagram and stuff. But go to conventions, talk to pro artists, talk to the editors, and show them your stuff. And don't be discouraged if they say, "Oh, you're almost there," but no, you gotta work a little more on this and work a little better on that. And just keep at it, because that's really how people get work as actors or artists. Is you just got to let people know you're there and you're available.
It seems like there's always a Cleveland connection if you know where to look. And you've just heard about one with the story behind Howard the Duck. Thank you to Val Mayerik for the interview. You can follow his work at his website, valmayerik.com, which does include a few illustrations of Howard, along with his paintings of cowboys and dinosaurs. Thank you to Nylor for the song Phantasms, which you're hearing right now, and also heard at the beginning of the podcast. Be sure to follow Cleveland Magazine online at clevelandmagazine.com, on social media, and in print for more stories like this one. I'm Annie Nikoloff. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Cleveland Connection.